Yeah, that's a good question. So what I'm doing there is I'm stealing from one of my good friends and New Testament scholar up at the King's University in Edmonton, Andrew Rillera. Um, I'm stealing a kind of catchphrase that he kind of came up with in his book Lamb of the Free, which came out I think just after my fairly recent book with Douglas Campbell. Um, and it's a book that deals with issues of atonement and sacrifice and trying to figure out if we're actually really understanding what sacrifice means in the Old Testament in particular, at least initially, and then how the New Testament authors are actually using that material or not in their texts. So first you got to figure out, well, what is actually going on in the temple with things like sacrifice, which sacrifices are atoning and which ones aren't, because those distinctions actually matter quite a bit. Often we tend to just simply conflate sacrifice with atonement. And often what gets sort of inserted into that is a certain conception of substitution within that, that the sacrifice is sort of standing in for you, sort of being sacrificed and receiving something that you would otherwise get, yeah, or experience yourself. So the sacrifice is sort of like a stand-in for you. Tends to be how a lot of people think about sacrifice, and atoning sacrifice in particular, right? Um, that's not really what atonement does in the Old Testament. Kippur is the word that gets used. Kippur, sacrifice. It's not how it's used in the Old Testament. Kippur tends to just be used to talk about decontaminating spaces and places and objects and sort of purging those of contaminants. It's sort of like a kind of detergent that removes things, like gets it out of the space, right? That's what atonement does in the Old Testament. There are sacrifices that do other things, well-being sacrifices, um, and sacrifices that the worshipers actually sort of partake in and participate in and consume themselves. That's all over the place as well. So the question is, what do New Testament authors, and my interest being Paul in particular, when he's talking about Jesus Christ and the significance of Jesus' death? What does he use to talk about it? Is he drawing on atoning sacrificial language that is, I guess, substitutionary, or usually gets read as substitutionary? Is that what Paul's drawing on? Doesn't seem like it. It seems like what he really wants to say when he's talking about Jesus' death is exactly that. What I was just quoted as saying, stealing from my friend Andrew, Jesus died ahead of us and not instead of us. And what does that mean exactly? Jesus dies not in our stead to absorb something that we would otherwise deserve, namely execution. Christ dies ahead of us after having assumed our fleshly condition, bared it, lowered it, and terminated it on the cross. So he dies ahead of us. And because he assumed our flesh, we die behind him in some sense, time wise, basically. Because Paul is constantly thinking about Christ's death in terms of co-crucifixion. Christ's death is our death for him. We are co-crucified with Christ for him, right? One died, therefore all have died. There's a solidarity there. So when we talk about Christ dying ahead and not instead of us, it's to get at that sort of solidarity point that somebody like Paul in particular champions quite clearly in his texts, where what happens to Christ ahead of us happens to us, right? That's the whole point. It's getting at that kind of closeness between what happens to him happens to us instead of what happens to him happens to him instead of us, right? So that's the difference there. Yeah.